Welcome to another exciting episode here at Sartori Studios.
Have you ever stopped and wondered why some cultures, like the ancient Egyptians, are basically just history now, while others seem to last forever? We're going to dive into a really fascinating theory from Michael Sartori that kind of cracks the code on cultural survival and what happens when a culture breaks those rules. I mean, we see it all through history, right? Huge, powerful empires just crumble. Whole civilizations end up as just a paragraph in a textbook. But then you have others that, against all the odds, just keep on going. So what's the secret sauce? What's that magic ingredient that makes a culture last? Well, Sartori argues the answer is in this powerful metaphor. A culture has to have a gate. Sometimes that gate needs to be closed to protect its core identity, to know who it is. But, and this is the crucial part, that gate also has to open. It has to let in new information, new ideas, even correction. It's a balancing act. Because if the gate's always open, you just dissolve into everything else. But if it's always shut, you turn into a prison and stagnate. So what happens when that gate just stays locked shut? Let's actually explore that idea by looking at two incredible cultures that are, for very different reasons, basically frozen in time. And this is where it gets really interesting, because these two show completely opposite ways a culture can get stuck. On one hand, you've got the Samaritans, who survived by building a fortress around a very lean, ancient tradition. And on the other, you have the Piraha, who are so radically locked into the present moment that outside ideas literally can't find a way in. The Samaritans are amazing. They're like a living time capsule. They've held on for thousands of years, not by adapting and changing, but by keeping an incredibly simple and defensible core. Their scripture is just the first 5 books of the Bible. That's it. That makes their beliefs super easy to pass down, and all the constant debate with their neighbors actually kept them sharp. It forced them to know exactly who they were. Okay, now for the other extreme. Let's talk about the Piraha people down in the Amazon. These guys are, wow, they are fascinating because their entire way of life just turns our assumptions about language, thought, and reality completely upside down. They are a culture sealed off from the world, not by walls, but by the very structure of their minds. It all boils down to this one simple but totally radical rule. If you didn't see it with your own 2 eyes, it is not real, period. There's this famous story of a missionary trying to tell them about Jesus, and they asked him, "Did you see this man?" When he said no, they just completely lost interest. To them, it was just irrelevant information from a crooked head, which is their term for any non-para. And this is where it gets mind-bending, because their language is the very thing that builds the walls of their cultural prison. Their language has no concepts for numbers or colors and no real way to talk about the past. And this isn't just a vocabulary gap, it fundamentally shapes their reality. It makes it nearly impossible to absorb any outside ideas that rely on abstract thought. So both the Samaritans and the Piraha are static because they're missing that open gate. But what exactly is supposed to come through that gate? What is that vital ingredient that healthy cultures actually need? This is what Sartori calls the prophetic voice. It's a message that comes from outside the established system, from the wilderness, that chaotic, unknown place. It's the disruptive, sometimes uncomfortable truth that a culture has to hear to avoid becoming a rigid, self-referential prison. And to really get why this outside voice is so critical, Sartori uses this fantastic analogy based on the work of neuroscientist Ian McGilchrist. It reveals a kind of civil war that can happen inside our own heads and also within our cultures. So think of your brain as having 2 modes. McGilchrist calls the right hemisphere the master. It's intuitive, it sees the big picture, the whole forest. The left hemisphere is the emissary. It's analytical, detail-oriented, and breaks things down into manageable parts. It only sees the individual trees. Now, both are absolutely vital, but they're supposed to work together with the master in charge. The danger comes when the emissary, that detail-oriented left brain, stages a coup and forgets it works for the master. When a culture gets dominated by this reductionist, analytical thinking, it gets trapped. It dismisses anything it can't immediately categorize or measure, and it loses the big picture entirely. Anything new, anything from the wilderness, is suddenly seen as a threat to its fragile, hyper-organized system. And these cultural shifts, these takeovers by one way of thinking, they aren't always gradual. They can be triggered by what Sartori calls psychotechnologies. These are powerful mental tools like, say, the invention of the alphabet or a brand new core belief about reality that don't just add new information, but they fundamentally rewire how an entire civilization thinks. Okay, so this brings us right to the present day. Sartori argues that we are living through the rise of a new global psychotechnology, creating what he calls the emissaries' empire. He calls it the urban monoculture. What is that? It's a single, dominant, globalized worldview that is becoming increasingly intolerant of any competing ideas. It's the cultural equivalent of the emissary brain seizing total control, trying to create one unified, predictable, and centrally managed system. But here's the twist. Old authoritarian systems, they created martyrs. When you executed a prophet, you often just amplified their message. This new system is smarter. It doesn't make you a martyr. It makes you irrelevant. It silences dissent through mockery, cancellation, and digital exile. The message isn't amplified, it's simply erased from the conversation. So if this urban monoculture is so effective at silencing that prophetic voice from the wilderness, is there any hope? Where can we even look for that vital correction our culture needs to avoid becoming a prison? Well, Sartori argues that trying to change the big centralized institutions is a losing battle. They're already captured. Instead, we have to look to the fringes. The modern prophetic voice isn't a booming sermon from the mountaintop. It's found in what's local, in what's overlooked by the mainstream, and in new, innovative spaces. You know, the perfect modern parable for this is Moneyball. The Oakland A's baseball team couldn't beat the big market teams by playing their game, so their manager, Billy Beane, he changed the game. He looked for value where no one else was looking, in overlooked stats, and he found a hidden treasure of undervalued talent. And this isn't some new idea. This ancient parable describes the exact same strategy. It's about having the vision to see immense value where others just see a dirt field. The man in the story, he doesn't argue with anyone. He quietly recognizes the treasure, sells everything he has, and buys the whole field. He wins by seeing what no one else could. And that brings us right back to the beginning. In a culture that seems to be building a prison with a gate that won't open, the real prophetic voices, the real treasures, are out there in the wilderness, hidden in plain sight. So in a world that only values the obvious, the loud, and the centrally approved, the final question is, what overlooked field will you explore?